Okay, well, let's take a look at a couple of these problems, and then maybe go back. I'll take a look at a couple of questions here, and to kind of clear up any issues or problems, excuse me, challenges you may have with respect to ABC costing. First of all, I want to take a look at number 16, which looks at this cost hierarchy. And it's not just a matter of, okay, memorizing batch, okay, unit, facility, product level cost, but be able to understand how costs behave. So if you're taking a look, for example, indirect manufacturing labor, well, the idea is that labor should increase proportionally as the number of units that you produce increase. So that would be considered a unit level cost. And because it's increasing proportionally, it tends to be the most accurate way of allocating overhead. So to the extent that you can, you want to try to associate all of these unit level costs together. Now, the second one here, the a batch level cost, are those that are kind of related to when a certain group of activities or a group of products might be produced. So purchase order, okay? So that might be 525,000. Well, okay, well, how many times do we have to create a purchase order? So there may be several different costs involved with a purchase order. So that might be more associated with a batch level cost. Indirect materials would generally always be a unit level cost. Just like indirect labor, they're going to go up and down proportionally. These are going to be related to the number of purchases that I make. Sort of, purchases are really not related to units, maybe somewhat indirectly, but the more might be treated as a batch level cost. Now, a more pure, if you will, sort of batch level cost would be setup, because every time you produce units, let's say a different item, you're going to have to go through and make some changes on the factory floor. That's not inexpensive, and so every time I do that for a particular product, I'm going to have to associate those costs with that product. Designing is always going to be a product level cost. So again, as I move from unit to batch to product level cost, I'm losing some specificity. Okay, I'm losing a certain degree of exactness or accuracy. But if I can associate this with a particular product, then I can average it over the total units that I might produce with that redesign. Now, depreciation and maintenance. Generally, maintenance might be a function of the number of units I produce, so that could be sort of a unit level cost. Depreciation could be more specifically a facility level cost. For example, depreciation on a building. What I'm getting at is that depreciation doesn't fit nicely and neatly into any particular category. You're going to have to look at the particulars and decide how, when, and where does it best fit into that. Now, you'd like to treat it as a unit level cost if I can do something like units of production. Probably more likely it's going to be maybe a product level cost. If this machine is only related to this particular product, that's better than a facility level cost. So these things that are related to the factory, which is producing a number of different items, okay, fine. At my final batch, if I can't make something a unit, batch, or product level cost, then I'm forced to treat it as a facility level cost. And that's the least accurate. And probably in this case, you're going to end up having to amortize that over some activities such as machine hours, or labor dollars. Okay, now number 19 is a kind of a relatively simple, but sometimes simple problems like this are also the best because I think it really incorporates everything that you really need to know about activity-based costing without making it overly difficult. So what they've done here for you is to take the total overhead cost of $308,600 and they divided it into these three different pools. Again, going back to some of the theory, that these are, in a sense, unit level, batch level, or product level type of cost. Okay, and then design costs would be made up of several different indirect costs. Production would be made up of several different production-related costs. Same thing with engineering. And more importantly, these are activities that we are doing and that we are measuring. And these seem to have a good cause and effect relationship. The more machine hours we incur, the more engineering costs we incur. The more design hours we incur, the more design costs we incur. Again, part of it is you could say, okay, well, we've run regression, but again, you have to have that kind of before or a priori idea that, okay, these things seem to be related. Likewise, too, here are the total activities that are associated with each of those costs. So, for example, design, if it's going to be done in terms of design hours, then we've identified that 110 hours associated with this customer or this particular product, 200 here and 80 here, or for a total of 390. Well, okay, we'll come back to the solution here in a minute. Do the same thing for here. So one is I'm going to have to take the sum of all these activities and then go back and find out what proportion each of these constitutes, and then multiply the total cost times that. So in terms of what they first ask you to do, just the peanut butter plant-wide approach, well, fine. Take the total overhead, divide it by, in this case, if they want it on machine hours, okay, add them up as 4,000 hours. So you come up with 7715. So the application rate, if that was if that's what I wanted, I would go back to the table we have. They've identified 120 machine hours there, 2,800, 1,080 here. So you can see the biggest chunk of the overhead is going to be made up, is going to be allocated to Holden because they're consuming more of the machine hours, less to Leyland, and very little to United. But again, the problem is, there are other overhead costs that have nothing to do with machine hours. And so that creates a little bit of a problem in terms of, well, did we overcost or undercost these products? All right, so going back to activity-based costing, I need to come up with these rather than one predetermined overhead rate like we did up here with a 7750. What we're doing is doing it 3 times. So taking the total overhead that's been designated as design, divided by the total CAD hours, you come up with this rate of 100. And do the same thing with the other 2 costs. Divide the cost by their respective activities. So what I'm going to do is, rather than coming up with 1 rate for each item, I'm going to come up with 3 rates. So this is where it begins to get a little bit, not so much complex, but kind of tedious to have to say, okay, fine, now I'm going to have to determine what these rates are, and then take those times the number of hours that each one consumes. So the design, well, we know the application rate. That's here. Well, we go back and look at 390, 110 is United, 200 is Holden, and 80 is Leyland. And do the same thing with the other cost. And you just go through and you have to do it a number of different times. So in this case, it's kind of nice because they're only looking at 3 overhead pools, and so it's relatively straightforward. Again, you don't have to have, theoretically, I could have more, but that doesn't necessarily add more accuracy having more overhead pools if the costs don't really fit in real well. So the total overhead that I would apply to each of the products are these respective amounts: 23,800 to United, 192,800, and 92,000 over here. And now you can begin to see we have a problem. If I'm looking at this issue of overcosting and or undercosting. Now, remember, this activity-based costing is considered the gold standard in terms of accurate costing. So the assumption, if the question is asked, well, did they overcost or did they undercost? Okay. Well, again, don't worry so much about this issue of ratios. What you're concerned about is making a comparison between these 2 numbers here. Again, assuming that these numbers here associated with activity-based costing are the correct numbers. So if 9258 is the correct cost under activity-based costing, and under the old plant-wide rate you were costing at 23,000, you have a serious problem. You are seriously overcosting it. So this would be a case of overcosting. Okay, because what I'm doing is, this is what they're doing now, and this is what they could be. And if this is a correct answer, then it's overcosted. Well, you have just the opposite. Here, this is undercosted. Okay. In this case, we really don't know complex or simple. And here you have overcosted for the same reasons. Okay. And again, the problem is that if I'm using this, the 23,800 as my cost estimate, and marking it up by 10%, then I'm way overpricing my product. And the same thing would be true here with Leyland. I'm overpricing it. And the penalty for my company is that I will lose sales. My customers will go someplace else if I'm overcharging the product or the service. Conversely, if I'm basing my cost on 192,000, marking it up, I may be, well, selling it at less than cost. And while my sales may increase and I think I'm doing well, I'm going to have the problem of the paradox of explaining, well, why are my revenues increasing but my profit is decreasing? Well, because I'm selling it at less than cost. And I can't continue to do that over an extended period of time. So don't worry about the issue of the ratios. I'm not going to ask you to calculate the ratios because I'm not sure that they're really particularly super informative. I sort of prefer the simple explanation that, oh, this is overcosted, this is undercosted, by how much, and what are the consequences of doing that? That's really the takeaway from this. One takeaway is coming up with the activity-based costing rates, okay, apply them to the respective goods or services that I'm selling, determining the true cost, okay, these are considered to be the gold standard of the true cost, compare them against the peanut butter or plant-wide approach, assuming that what you are doing is a plant-wide approach and you should be doing activity-based costing. Well, do we overcost or undercost? And so what do? Well, you want to move towards these numbers. That is the 9258, the 83,000, the 260,000. I'm going to have to begin now pricing according to that. And that may present some problems with me managing my customers if I begin to charge them more or charge them less. If I'm going to charge them less, they're not going to argue with me. But if I'm going to have to charge them more, they may not be real happy with me. But I have no choice. I'm going to have to price them so that I can earn the profit that I need to earn. Particularly that my investors, my shareholders are going to be demanding of me. And what they've done here is just to kind of break down the proportional amounts of the activities that each of these is consuming. And notice that if this is what I was using as my plant-wide rate, machine hours, you notice that there's some big discrepancies between this number here and versus that number, okay? There are some big discrepancies. So the plant-wide approach really doesn't work real well in terms of allocating a number of different costs that simply don't behave in the same manner. And activity-based costing is generally considered to be more accurate. It's more expensive, and it may not always be appropriate, but it's always going to be considered the more accurate measure, simply because you're associating cost with an activity which seems to cause that particular cost. Okay, I will let you look through this general information here. I'm not going to go through and explain all of that, okay? And I think in many cases we have done that. Pricing is an important issue for any company, and you don't always have to mark up. You can charge whatever the market will allow you, but you need a comparison. And you need to be able to answer the question, am I making a profit on a particular product or service? And the only way that you can really know that is by objectively coming up with the most accurate cost estimate that you can. And that's where activity-based costing can help you. You know, the amount of how much finer do I have to create my activity-based costing system? Do I have to have more cost pools? And the answer is no. And that is that I go with what seems to be better at the time. And if I'm happy with that, then so be it. Okay, well, we'll talk a little bit about this problem here. Make sure I've got the right number here for you, number 23. And as I said, a little bit later on, it's a little bit hard to read. These are the numbers I'm particularly concerned about. These are the total of my overhead cost. I've identified the revenues that I'm going to make per job. okay, the number of jobs I'm going to do, okay. I've identified my direct materials and my direct labor. And I also know the number of hours that's going to require me for each job. I know the number of setup hours for each job, okay. They give me the activities here, the number of purchase orders that each particular product or service requires. The design cost, well, okay, fine, they gave you that. Marketing costs, well, this is a function of my revenues. Well, fine, take the 5% times the 400 times the 600, okay? Do the same thing with administrative cost, okay? These are going to be administrative costs of $24,000 are going to be allocated based on my direct labor costs. Go back up to here, kind of proportionally divided. All right, so the first thing I ask you to do is to determine the peanut butter or the plant wide rate. So if I add up all of these costs in this column, okay, these are going to equal to 201,500. And if I divide that by my machine hours, which is what they're asking you to do here, you come up with this plant-wide rate or this predetermined overhead rate of 33,583. So under that method, if I'm using the plant-wide rate, I have my two particular things that I'm doing, a standard job or a special job. I've identified the number of the amount of supplies of direct materials. I've identified the amount of labor in each job. Okay. And then because there are 10 machine hours in each job, I'm going to, and this is the tricky part, each job, regardless of its complexity, requires 10 machine hours. So therefore, I will apply, strangely enough, the same overhead, which probably tells you that maybe we have a problem with the system. If I have a special or more complex job versus a more simple job, if I'm applying the same overhead across the board, I think I have a problem in terms of coming up with cost estimates. As you'll see, you really only have about a $35 difference between the two out of total amount. A 5% difference, 6% difference, maybe, but it doesn't seem to be proportional, simple versus complex. So this would be a good example where activity-based costing would certainly be a something that they should take a look at to see if they can actually come up with a better system of costing. So activity-based costing would say, fine, this is what I want here. I want to derive these application rates, okay? So rather than having one plant-wide rate, I'm going to take my machine operations, they identify the cost, and I also have my machine hours. So the 6,000 machine hours divided by that into 75,000 gives me the 1,250. 3,000 of setup hours divided into 45,000 setup cost gives me the $15. And then so on, okay? And again, I'm sorry, I can't really, this is part of the solution guide. They have all these kind of odd things in here. But I'm going to go through and look at the number of purchase orders. Okay, there were 900 purchase orders. At total cost 18, I have $20 per purchase order. Design, well, okay, fine. I know what that is. Marketing, okay, I'll come down, okay, that they've already allocated for me. I don't really need to worry about that. There's the 4 and the 16. Marketing is 5 cents per dollar. We'll come back to that issue in terms of revenues. Administrative cost, okay, we know that as a function of my labor cost. So now once I have the rates, then I go through and look at each particular job. And I need to know, I'll have identified here, that the cost of supplies here is going to be based on the amount of, if we go back up here, the application rate for supplies is machine hours, okay? And the machine hours, are 400 and 200 hours, respectively. So at $100 per hour, I'm going to apply 40,000 and 25,000. Or excuse me, 125, okay? Okay, and do the same thing. What I want to identify are the units of activity here, okay? And then take the cost and apply them accordingly. That is the $90. Go back up here. What is my application rate? Okay, oops. and then apply them accordingly. All right, I'm sorry, I'm making this more complicated. These are my direct materials and direct labor. Okay, those are pretty straightforward. Okay, now we're looking at the overhead. I'm sorry, I made this more complicated than what it should be. These are my direct costs. So those are given to you, and then I apply them accordingly. So now I go back to my rates that I determine times those activities that I determine. So in the case of machine, $12.50 per hour at 4,000 and 2,000, I get 50,000 and 25,000. Purchase orders, okay, 1,600 and 1,400 times $20 gives me this amount. Okay, these are my design cost, okay, my setup cost, my purchase order cost, okay, my marketing, my administrative cost. Again, this black, okay, the administrative cost, okay, it's jumbled up here. It's a lot more complicated. It looks more difficult than what it is. Really, what I'm doing is, essentially, once I have this, then I'm going to take this times the 1,600, this times the 1,400. Take this times 4,000, take this times 2,000. Okay, take the $20 for my purchase orders. Well, times 400, okay, and then times 500. And then this one, I'd have to figure out what the total sales are for each of these, times 5%. Take this number here, then times the respective administrative, to determine my administrative cost. Well, nonetheless, what I end up with here is kind of what I would have suspected. If this is my simple job and this is my complex job, then I should expect to see that, in fact, I'm really paying less for overhead for a simple job than I would with a complex job. And again, it's common sense. A simple object should require less overhead than does a complex job. And the problem was, under my standard way of doing things, with my plant-wide rate, I was assuming that each one was equal. So if I'm looking at this and thinking, okay, gee, if I'm looking at these two things, I thought the costs were $525. In fact, they're $473. I overcosted it. Okay, this is overcosting. This one here is undercosting. Okay, I wasn't putting enough in there. So as I move to activity-based costing, I kind of find what I expect to see, and that is that more complex jobs really should have a higher cost, which is what I would expect. So versus simple jobs should have lower total cost, simply because they're probably going to be consuming less overhead. So in this case, I get the kind of results I would expect, and I have far more confidence in these numbers here as being accurate measures. And then I can plan accordingly. Now create a new pricing scheme so that I can earn a profit on these two products. Okay, if you're a little bit confused by the numbers that they give you up here with all of the error messages, it's understandable. It's kind of hard to interpret. But I threw in number 24 here as well. It's essentially the same thing, interior versus exterior, simple versus complex, okay? And essentially doing the same thing, but it's set up, the solutions are nice and neatly done here. And so it's a matter of doing activity-based costing versus plant-wide rate with numbers that are easily interpretable. So I'm not going to go through here all over again. But here they give you the cost and they give you the respective activities. And they say, okay, marketing is 3% of the sales. And so they're asking you to sum up these to come up with this plant-wide rate. So I take my plant-wide overhead and my total machine hours and come up with my plant-wide rate of 51.16 and apply it accordingly to my job here. So what I have to start with is total materials, total labor, total overhead, and then divide by the number of units I produce to come up with my respective cost per unit under the plant-wide rate. Then go through, okay, in this case, it's a little bit kind of a long, involved process, but I want to determine this. This is what I'm really about. Taking the total of a pool of cost divided by an activity And you may, in some of the questions, be asked, well, is it unit level, batch level, facility, or product level cost? And then find out what the rate is. And then go through and say, okay, fine, here are my direct materials and direct labor. Presumably that shouldn't change materials and labor. And then go through and say, okay, well, fine. If this is my cost, okay, and this is a batch level cost, well, 40 and 85, I'm going to allocate these costs respectively. What I like, okay, this is a nice one because it's set up nicely. Here's my rate. Here are my two respective activities, and allocated accordingly. So what I want to do here, what's nice is that they didn't include kind of clutter up the individual unit cost. What they have here is the total cost associated with each product. 544,650, 604,150. And then what I want to do is divide it by the number of units. So I find I have 170 and 335. And then the question is, okay, did I overcost or undercost? Well, kind of what I was suspected. Under my simple, I overcosted by $25. And I seriously undercosted with my complex. And again, you have the respective problems that you run into because of that. So I'm going to leave this for you to kind of take a look at. It's a little bit nicer and neater to read with this one. But if you have any questions, if anything is troubling to you, please stop by and see me, and I'll be glad to explain it.